When you watch the mainstream media news, do you feel a little twitch? Is there a tingle in your left hand? Is your jaw locked? We have the solution. Welcome to Reasonable Arguments, the podcast where thoughtful debate meets unfiltered fun. Coming to you from Sarasota, Florida, where your hosts, Jamie Miller and Jennifer Bash, make sense of the chaos. Together, we mix informed conservative commentary, playful banter, and just the right amount of nonsense to keep it entertaining. This is Reasonable Arguments, and now your hosts, husband and wife duo, Jamie and Jennifer.
Hey, babe, how are you doing?
Doing great. How are you?
Doing great. We've got another great show and another guest, the second part of our 4-part series on legal and illegal immigration. So we'd like to introduce everyone to Mark Krikorian of the Center for Immigration Studies. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Well, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So you're obviously a nationally recognized expert on immigration. You've committed your career to immigration and immigration policy. And tell us a little bit about that and how you got into it and some of your successes along the way.
Well, I don't know. I think like most people, I just kind of dumbed into it. I mean, I sort of fell backward into this. I was after graduate school, I got a master's degree in international relations. Instead of getting a job, I was able to go to, I'm Armenian, and so they had a deal to go to Soviet Armenia as a student. This was back in the mid-'80s. The Soviet Union was still around. So I spent a couple of years doing that, came back, and kind of what got me into the issue was not immigration initially, but bilingual education, bilingualism, that kind of thing. I grew up speaking Armenian as a kid. I was born here, my parents were born here, but they spoke English to each other, Armenian to us. And, you know, I learned English in kindergarten just like any other kid, regardless of where they're from or anything else. And so it always kind of annoyed me to have bilingual education in school. I thought it was bad for immigrant kids, bad for the country. So I went to a group called U.S. English. I don't even know if it's still around anymore, but they were like an official English group. I said, hi, I have no skills whatsoever, but I can speak English. So what's the story? They said, well, we don't have any openings, but there's this place upstairs that works on immigration that we heard they're looking for a newsletter editor. This is back when they had, physical paper newsletters. That was a group that dealt with immigration. It wasn't CIS, but anyway, so that's how I got the bug. And so I've been doing this ever since.
He's the second person. We've interviewed 2 people, and he's the second one. It was like, I just kind of fell into it.
I just kind of made it my life's work.
Yep.
We try to look at things from all angles. So how do you respond to critics who say that the Center for Immigration Studies downplays the personal stories of immigration? And I think we're going to get into this a little bit more. I think your philosophies I've read is that we're taking talent and treasure away from other countries when we take the best and brightest from every country to have them immigrate here.
Well, the general point about do we focus on the personal stories of immigrants? Does that get lost in kind of the cold-blooded analysis of numbers and statistics and stuff? And I'd say there's a saying in, I think it's economics, but a lot of social sciences, they say the plural of anecdote is not data. In other words, individual stories don't necessarily tell you anything, except in a sense, it's not really true because anecdotes do add up to data as long as you look at a representative sample of different stories. See, that's the thing. And when people say, well, you need to consider these individual stories, they're talking about curated specific stories, usually selected by immigration lawyers and seized by reporters to send a particular message rather than look at the broad example of personal stories, both of immigrants, some of their stories are successful, some aren't, but also of Americans who are affected by immigration and their personal stories, and kind of put all of that together. And in a sense, that's sort of what we try to do rather than just focus on a handful of sob stories that the New York Times wants you to talk about.
So how can immigration policy protect American interests?
Well, in a sense, the whole purpose of immigration law is protecting Americans. In other words, that's why you have it. Otherwise, I don't know, why not just let anybody move here? The first point is, who are we protecting? And do the Americans, the people in America, the territory of America, warrant protection more than other places? And obviously, the government of the United States, the whole reason it exists, and I read this in the Constitution right at the beginning there, so I'm pretty sure this is right. We, the people, formed the Constitution in order to protect American interests, American welfare, American, jobs, American physical security. And so immigration does that in a whole bunch of ways. By setting limits on the number of people who move here, we prevent American workers from having to compete with every other worker everywhere in the world on an equal basis. And that's just not right. Conditions are different everywhere. Our cats are at home. They're not in the office.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
He will sleep until he hears my voice, and then it's like, okay.
The limits on immigration also protect our social safety net. And in a modern society, whether you're conservative or liberal or middle of the road, nobody's getting rid of our social safety net. Some people want it to be tighter, looser, different rules. All of that's true. Mm-hmm. All of that's a legitimate debate. It's not going anywhere, though. And as Milton Friedman said, you can't have open immigration in a welfare state. And so if we're going to tax ourselves to help our fellow citizens, we need to limit who's coming in and has access to that. And then finally, physical security. Because most people everywhere in the world are just normal people. But there's plenty of bad guys. We've got 7 billion people outside the United States. You don't have to, 0.01% of them still is a whole lot of bad guys. And so the point of immigration is to keep out criminals, keep out terrorist threats, all of that stuff. And so again, it functions as a kind of almost like the skin on your body is designed to be sort of a membrane to protect you. It doesn't mean nothing gets through, obviously, but it is a kind of protection, and immigration policy serves the same function.
Excellent. I'm so impressed with your website that, I'm getting ready for this. I spent hours and I learned things, but it's just, there's overwhelming information there. If you're a college student and you want to write a paper on immigration policy, your website's the place to go.
CIS.org. Don't forget, I always forget CIS.org.
CIS.org. We'll make sure we put it in our show notes and let people know, because there really is a wealth of information there. But I found that, you highlight costs. How do you argue with, immigration, job creation, and, particularly for low-skilled American workers, how does immigration impact job creation and the impact on American workers?
Immigration, like any policy, creates costs, it creates benefits. There are winners, there are losers. The thing is that the losers are disproportionately Americans at the bottom of the job market. In other words, if you're, say, upper middle class, your family income is, $250,000 a year, something like this, immigrants probably aren't competing with you all that much. And at the same time, immigration probably means that you have an easier time hiring a cheap landscaping service. And, maybe if you have a cleaning lady or something, it's cheaper than if there was no immigration. So some people benefit, but the flip side of that is that people who are in less demand in the labor market lose out, because what immigration does is it loosens the labor market. In other words, it has more people chasing jobs, and obviously the presence of immigrants creates more jobs itself. There's no question about that. Nonetheless, it loosens the labor market and creates a situation where instead of employers having to hustle to find workers, the opposite happens, where workers have to hustle to find jobs. And government policy is going to do one or the other of those two things. And obviously there needs to be some balance. You don't want to make it too hard to find workers. But in a country of a third of a billion people, spans an entire continent, I'm not too worried about getting so far out of balance we need to start letting more people in. What I'm worried about is kind of around the 50-yard line, if you will. Where's the balance? Does policy mean that employers have to hustle to find workers by offering more money or different benefits, or they have to look for workers in places they wouldn't have looked, that kind of thing? Or does immigration policy mean there's more workers chasing jobs and they have to kind of hustle to find the jobs? I think it's responsible to, again, around the 50-yard line, make it a little bit harder for employers to find workers, so they have to go out of their way and offer more money and all of that. So that's
like that. I like that analogy because one of our largest employers here in Sarasota is a window maker, a window manufacturer. And as you can imagine with hurricanes, that's a very lucrative business here. But they've had to do things like provide on-site daycare, on-site healthcare, on-site. They have nearly everybody in that company goes to the company doctor because they can keep them on site, and it makes it more efficient. The kids are there, the doctor's there, and those are quality of life issues that, if employers have to keep employees happy versus, like you said, the other way around, you end up with these additional benefits.
And it's even more than just benefits. That's clearly part of it. But it depends on the situation. But think about workers themselves. Which workers have a better chance of getting hired at all? If you're an ex-con, look, the odds are 50-50 you're a dirtbag and are going to end up back in jail. But what about the other 50? You know what I mean? In other words, it's a lot easier for them to get a hearing from some employer if there's nobody else that they can hire. Let's say there's a American kid with Down syndrome. Not very serious. He can work, but he needs a little bit of oversight and management and handling. And you're the manager of the Walmart, and you want to hire somebody to go and get the shopping carts from the parking lot. You could hire that kid, or you could hire the adult immigrant who doesn't need any hand-holding, doesn't need any real supervision. Who are you going to hire? The manager of that Walmart is not a bad guy for hiring that immigrant. Congress is the problem because they created the situation that they put that manager in. Or even just to give a last example, say you're a single mom. Your kid gets home from work at 3 p.m. You need to be home at 3 p.m. But you're applying for a job that says you need to be there till 5 p.m. If there's 5 other people in the waiting room applying for that job, the employer is going to say, look, I'd love to hire you, but I just can't. And the job is till 5 o'clock. Sorry. If there's nobody else in the waiting room applying for that job, the manager is like, okay, crap. Oh, I'll cover the last 2 hours. You're hired. You know what I mean? In other words, it empowers people with the least power economically in our society. And that should be a goal that we as Americans want to achieve for our fellow citizens.
So how does it work now that, because throughout my career history, you've always needed a social security number in order to work. So how do they get around that?
Well, legal immigrants obviously have social security numbers, but illegal immigrants, they borrow, steal, or make up social security number information, ID information in general. There are people who are brokers who sell fake numbers or sell real numbers they have stolen from some kid in Puerto Rico, say. And so then you become that kid's name, but he's 4 years old and you're not. So anyway, there's all kinds of ways to do this. And then obviously are employers who are just hiring people for cash and are breaking the law. But most illegal immigrants, believe it or not, work on the books. They have a fake or stolen or borrowed social security number. And that's why a system that DHS runs called E-Verify, just like it sounds, it electronically verifies your information so that when a company hires you, they have to submit the payroll information, to Social Security and IRS. Well, they then go to a site, E-Verify site, and they put in the name, number, and date of birth. And if they're real and they match, you get a green light back. And if they're not, you don't. And the problem is it's voluntary. So only about half of new hires go through this system. It's one of the most important objectives. It's not a silver bullet, but it's probably the lowest hanging fruit in immigration enforcement. is to make that a standard part of the hiring process, just like submitting the payroll information, to Social Security.
Well, while
What?
we're on, go ahead.
No, I was just curious as to why is it voluntary?
Because neither the left nor the corporate right wants it to be mandatory. The folks on the left oppose immigration enforcement, and they think that, anybody who wants to move here should move here. And then corporate, the sort of lobbyist folks on the right want, their clients to be able to hire anybody they want. So there's always been this resistance. Now, in Florida even, Governor DeSantis twice now has tried to make it mandatory for all hiring, which states can do on their own as a condition of getting a business license. The Supreme Court has ruled that. In both cases, Republicans in the legislature fought him, and he got something, but he didn't get, in other words, it's now mandatory for certain employers, but it's not universal for everybody. And it's not because the Democrats stopped him, although I assume they worked with the business lobbyists, but it's mainly because Republicans in his own legislature stopped it. So this is just another indication of how immigration isn't really purely a right-left thing. It's more like an up-down thing. And you see that in this E-Verify debate.
I like to say a lot of these issues aren't right or left, they're circular.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like, where are you on the circle?
Yeah.
And one policy question we're going to ask everyone, and then Jennifer has a couple of questions. But if you could get Congress to wave a magic wand and change one thing and have it become law, what would be your one piece of advice in whether it's legal or illegal immigration? Like, what would be the one law?
One thing I picked that I actually could happen would be making E-Verify a universal part of hiring. Sort of my more blue sky one thing that I would want would be cutting legal immigration in half. Because we take 1.1 million legal immigrants every year. Nobody intended for this to happen. When they changed the immigration law in the mid-60s, nobody thought that they were restarting immigration, and yet they did. And so we've been doing this for 50 years. We need a breather. And so that would be, in a sense, that's sort of our longer-term goal here at the center. But as far as like one, 10-word law, something like that, yeah, mandating E-Verify for all new hires.
Okay. Can you explain the optional practical training and how it impacts the economy and college graduates?
Sure. It's optical practical training. Its shorthand is OPT, is one of those phony baloney statuses I referred to that are supposedly temporary, but really aren't. So it's part of like a procession of statuses. It's for foreign students. You come here as a foreign student. So you're not an immigrant, you don't have a green card, you have what they call an F1 visa. And the whole point of it is you're studying somewhere to get a degree. Well, the tech companies said, we need to come up with a way of getting more of these people to stay, and Congress won't give it to us. So let's come up, and the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration is the one they pitched this to. Let's take this little bit of wiggle room in the law where after you graduate, you're permitted to do a little bit of an internship, even though you're finished with your classes, as long as it's directly related to your studies. They said, let's turn this into a work visa. And so that's what it is now. If you're a foreign student, you get to stay for a year working anywhere you want on any kind of job with no tax withholding because you're a student. And if you were in a tech field, you get to work for a total of 3 years in this supposed internship status, which is what OPT is. And again, not only do you not pay Social Security taxes, your employer doesn't even have to pay Social Security taxes on you.
Oh, wow.
Again, you're a student, supposedly. So we are literally subsidizing the employment of new foreign student grads over new American grads.
Putting our graduates at a real disadvantage.
Extreme. It's
Absurd.
And again, the employers, again, over and over again, the employers aren't even the bad guy here. Why was this ridiculous system even allowed to exist? If you're an employer, you kind of have a responsibility to use this abusive and, frankly, in my opinion, illegal program, because Congress didn't create it even. This was done through regulation, and nobody's stopped it. There have been attempts in the courts to stop it. And the Supreme Court may be taking up a case related to this. We'll see soon.
So if Donald Trump is doing a lot of executive orders, we won't get into those, but is this something that he could change with an executive order?
He could have gotten rid of it 2 months ago and hasn't. And there's no reason this should exist. It's totally made up. It has no basis in law, it's not illegal. Well, I think it probably is illegal, but it's not. Congress didn't create this. And the law says a foreign student visa is only for when you're studying for your degree. So I actually would say it is illegal. The problem is, and the reason the courts haven't struck it down, is the issue of standing. You don't want to get into a whole show about that, but you have to show in order to sue that you have a specific harm that warrants the court taking the case. And so they call that standing. And courts have just said, yeah, nobody has standing. Nobody. So what?
Wouldn't a U.S. citizen who graduates from college immediately have standing if I'm not a lawyer, but they're at a disadvantage. Their resume is going to the bottom of the pile compared to an illegal immigrant.
You would think. We haven't gotten there yet, although we're considering trying something like that ourselves, but so far it's failed.
So the guy that was arrested for protesting Hamas, if he was under this, could that be grounds to be like, this is just not working?
Oh, certainly. But he had a green card. He was beyond that, because when people have this OPT status, they're doing it because they want to stay here they want to stretch out their period of staying here as long as possible. And they're applying for what's called an H-1B visa, which is a whole other show, basically used by tech companies. And it's supposedly a temporary visa, but your employer can petition for you, apply for you to get a green card. So OPT is like part of this process where people who come in as students want to end up where that Columbia guy was, which is with a green card. So that's a different question. And there's actually very wide authority to revoke somebody's green card and throw them out of the country. It's not used very often. And the bar is higher than if you're just a tourist, because, you have a little more, skin in the game. But if the Secretary of State says your presence here is, contrary to the foreign policy interests of the United States, they can just yank it. Because until you become a citizen, until you raise your hand and say, I renounce all previous allegiances and you become a citizen, you're just a guest here, even if you're a green card holder.
So going back to OPT, when you said that they don't pay, the worker doesn't pay taxes for a period of up to 3 years, does that include federal income tax, or is that just Social Security tax?
Oh, they pay income tax. They don't pay any of the payroll tax. So that's Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment.
Yeah,
and again, if they're not going to be collecting, you can see, okay, well, maybe they shouldn't be paying. But the employer also doesn't have to pay. And so that's an enormous advantage or disadvantage for Americans trying to compete with them.
Wow. So how does immigration influence the availability and affordability of housing?
If you got more people chasing the same number of houses, prices are going to go up. There's just no way around it. And obviously, there's always homes being built too. But what immigration does, especially if it's very rapid as it is now, is it outstrips the ability of the economy to build enough houses for people. And that makes housing costs go up. There's just no way around that. And when you add on top of that all of the regulations that limit the ability to build houses. In California, I don't even know if you can build houses anyplace. You've got to, they've spent $100 billion or whatever it is on a railroad from one dusty mid-valley town to another, and they still haven't connected Bakersfield to Merced. And so how are they going to build houses? You know what I mean? So, and again, this is all a matter of scale. If immigration were lower, the housing market would more easily be able to deal with new arrivals. But under President Biden, the net number of immigrants in the country and so this includes people who left as well as who came in. So you add the plus and the minus, was more than 2 million a year on top of, Americans looking for houses. Housing construction can't keep up with that. So housing prices go up. It's just, there's no way around that. And then we've seen this in Australia and Canada and elsewhere. It's the same phenomenon. Mass immigration makes it hard for people to afford housing, and newcomers are a lot more likely to be willing to live 5 and 6 people and 8 people to a residence rather than Americans. And even worse, on top of that, what we found and I've seen this a number of times, local authorities are simply less willing to enforce residency, occupancy limits, if immigrants are involved than if Americans are involved. In other words, if there's 8 Americans, unrelated people living in a house, local suburban occupancy limit and rules will be enforced against them. There's 8 immigrants sleeping in shifts on beds. They're like, no, they're a protected class. It would be discriminatory if we enforce the law.
Really?
So yeah, there's a whole bunch of ways this is not good, especially for young people trying to start out and get a house.
So if you knew that this podcast episode was going to go out to the entire world, what is one thing that you would want everybody to know about immigration?
That's a good question. It is going out to the entire world, I hope. But
Absolutely.
I think the first thing to understand about American immigration policy is that it's a government policy that can go up and down. We've had a lot of immigration in the past. We've had times when we've had very little immigration. It's not like it's the 0th amendment to the Constitution that everybody in the world has to come here. It's like tax policy or military policy or anything else that you can turn the dials on. And my take on this is not that we need zero immigration. We're never going to have zero. We never should have zero immigration. But we need a breather. We need to take a break after 50 plus years of extremely high immigration. And we just released a report this is on our website, but it's up at the top, so it'll be easy to find, that we now have a higher percentage of immigrants in our population than has ever been recorded, higher even than during the Ellis Island period. And one of the reasons that big wave of immigration, which created a lot of its own problems, but it's worked out, was because we stopped it and allowed kind of the country to sort of digest the millions and millions of people we'd taken in. We need some kind of pause like that again.
Have you seen any economic data that suggests that things are either better or worse in sanctuary cities just from an economic standpoint due to their immigration policies?
Yeah, I don't know that it would be hard even to measure that. So the answer is no, I don't think so. Not because of sanctuary policies, just how do you separate out that from everything else? You know what I mean? And how do you separate all the problems they have from everything else? In other words,
Mark, we're very complex here.
Yeah. Well, that's a complex question that I'm not. I mean, my sense is I don't even think you could disentangle all of those things. The sanctuary policies have real effects, but the biggest effects they have are on public safety, because the whole point of a sanctuary policy is to protect criminals, literally by definition. Well, that's not, they say this is protecting our immigrant friends or whatever. No, the only thing a sanctuary policy does is protect criminals, because the whole point of it is to make sure that people who are arrested for non-immigration related crimes, they're driving drunk, selling drugs, beating their girlfriends, whatever it is, that when they're processed, and Homeland Security now gets that along with the FBI, they get everybody, when you fingerprint somebody, that goes to Homeland Security as well as to the FBI. And if ICE says, hey, this person's illegal, or we deported him 2 years ago, and coming back after you've been deported is a felony, the sanctuary city says, yeah, too bad. We're not handing him over to you. We're not telling you about him. We're not telling you when we're going to release him. They basically don't cooperate, because the point of a sanctuary policy is to make sure people who have been arrested for crimes are able to return to the same communities they committed the crimes in. So my point here is that its effects are mainly related to public safety, I think.
I don't understand, what is the benefit for cities to do this? And I know that Florida, we ruled that out, but what is the benefit?
It stems from a political belief that even if you're a criminal, and you should, serve whatever sentence you serve if the prosecutors in your city even want to prosecute you, that when the criminal justice system is done with you, you shouldn't have to go back to your home country. You should be able to just return to your life as usual and the basic kind of premise here is that there's no difference between citizens and non-citizens, between being legally here and illegally here. That's what drives the whole idea of sanctuary cities. And in a sense, arguing to people who believe in that there are public safety harms is kind of irrelevant to them, because they're not doing it for some benefit that they're going to yield. They're doing it because they reject the idea that American citizens are different from non-citizens, that legal residents are different from illegal residents. They just don't believe that those distinctions are morally defensible. I know. Yeah, well, I shake my head too, but I've been shaking my head for 30 years. So
that's one of the things that it always amazes me, the number of people who push back on social media who are friends of mine, not just, social media trolls or anything like that, who happen to be more liberal, really have no sense of what it means to be an American, and that as Americans, we have constitutional rights, and people who are visiting here do not have constitutional rights. And somehow we've allowed people who are visiting here, whether it's with a green card status or illegal or tourists, that they somehow have the right to come on our soil and protest our country. And I can't imagine going to Germany and protesting their country. I just can't imagine going on a vacation to protest. And the fact that people who are here as guests feel like they have that right is baffling to me, and that Americans are supporting that and have no idea that that's what makes us American, is that we have this thing called the Constitution that applies to us and us only.
Yeah,
well, you exactly said it. We don't do anything about it. That's why they feel they have the right.
Sure. I mean, I had a boss who once said, you teach people how to treat you. And we're teaching people to conduct themselves in this way.
That's 100%.
And, it really does get to the core problem, or the core disagreement maybe in immigration policy, is, does everyone in the world have the right to move here or not? And I posed the question that way, and it's like, well, that sounds like a stupid question. Obviously not. And yet that is the basis of the sort of at ground level, the disagreement over immigration, because much of the left and the libertarian right thinks that everyone in the world has a right to move here, with certain exceptions we make for terrorists and criminals, whereas everyone else in the world believes that no one has a right to move here, but we extend, with exceptions, certain people. In other words, is it a right or is it a privilege? And immigration clearly is a privilege that the American people extend to you, but much of our policy is driven by people who either consciously, or maybe even they've never really thought about it, think immigration is a right rather than a privilege. And that's really kind of the issue that you need to kind of force people to confront before you get to issues of, is OPT a good idea or what have you? You know what I mean? If we have no right to say no to somebody coming to our border, then all the rest of it's irrelevant.
That's great. That'll make a great clip, babes.
I'm on it.
So you've authored a couple of books, and they're not without controversy. I guess when you've written books, what did you write that became controversial that you maybe didn't expect, or that caught you off guard that it was so controversial?
Well, I don't know. I think I fully expected it to be controversial, and it was. I mean, the book I wrote in 2008, it's old now, and I got to think about maybe doing a new version of it, but it's the new case against immigration, both legal and illegal. And it was kind of, the one thing that did surprise me was that it was controversial enough inside Penguin that when my editor left to have a baby and didn't come back, they pulled the plug on the book, and even the Kindle you can't get now on Amazon. I mean, they have hard copies you can get, but anyway, I'm not bitter. The point I tried to make in there, and this is something that I think is still a kind of basic unified field theory, if you will, of immigration limits, is that people often will be concerned about immigration. They'll say, the effect on the job market, or effect on welfare, effect on security or assimilation. The argument I made in the book is that they're all the same thing, is that it's like blind men touching different parts of an elephant, the saying, and they think they have different things. Somebody grabs the tail and says, this is a broom. Somebody bumps into the leg and they say it's a tree. It's all the same elephant. Immigration's the same thing. All of the things we're concerned about stem from the fact that mass immigration is not compatible with the goals and characteristics of a modern society in a way that was less true 100 or 200 years ago. We have a post-industrial knowledge-based economy. We have a welfare state we didn't have in the past. The world has shrunk because of transportation and communications, and that's good in a whole bunch of ways, but it also makes assimilation and security functions of immigration more difficult. So the point here is it's all one thing. And I guess it would be pretty controversial. I wish more people were outraged and would start arguing about it, because I think it is actually at the base of a lot of what we're talking about. It's not controversial enough. That's my problem. And
I've argued in my Substack of the same name, Reasonable Arguments, that the liberals have kind of hurt themselves on things like gun control because of their immigration policy, because more Americans now realize that they have to protect themselves. And so there's these adverse impacts of their super liberal policies, that have impacted, that are making Americans saying, hey, listen, I don't really think I need, 30 rounds in a rifle, but by gosh, I need a rifle.
Yeah, right.
And even the most liberal people who are like, hey, I don't need 30 rounds. Now, I argue that you need 30 rounds because, people say you don't need a weapon of war. And I say, well, you don't need a weapon of war until the war is in your driveway. And so that's a whole different topic. But I think there's some impacts of this mass immigration that Biden especially implemented that are really going to turn liberals on their head on many other issues, affordable housing or some. I'm not asking you to get into the gun issue. You're more economics and things like that. So, yeah. But I was just kind of pointing out that none of this happens in a vacuum.
Yeah, I don't have 30 round mags for my AR or for my 9mm, I'm afraid. But I mean, I've never had to use either one except at the range, so I'm okay so far. But to take your point, I'd actually say that it's Biden's immigration policy that got people to think about immigration policy as well. In other words, it's not even so much the knock-on effects. It's that 4 years of Biden essentially not enforcing or refusing to enforce much of the immigration law has actually hardened opinion about immigration in general. They've basically shown the public, look, it's kind of like proof of concept for open borders. It's like, here you are. They gave it their trial run. What do you think? Well, what people thought was, oh my God, let's elect Donald Trump again and have him come back. So in a sense, I don't want to get into debate about the 2020 election or anything, but he lost. Look, he lost. But it's good he lost, in my opinion, because there's a Russian, Lenin used to say, the worse, the better. In other words, things have to get really bad before you can make progress on some issues. And I think Biden's unbelievably bad immigration policies were actually kind of necessary to move the issue forward. I wish it weren't that way, but it is.
I think it's ironic that people get so upset about, the dismantling of USAID and things like that, but yet there's 300,000 kids that are missing that nobody even talks about. I think that it's just amazing, the hypocrisy of it all.
Yeah, and frankly, most of those kids are probably just with their illegal alien parents, and the parents don't want to answer a phone call from DHS, you know what I mean? But some of them aren't. And if this was under Trump, there were 300,000 kids that Health and Human Services couldn't find. You'd be hearing about it every day, everywhere. The New York Times would be issuing multiple issues every day just so they could cover the front page with stories about it. And yet, under Biden, it was like, ho-hum, we don't care.
So, Mark, let our listeners know about your podcast and what it's all about.
We have a weekly podcast called Parsing Immigration Policy, like parsing a sentence, in grammar class. Probably, my I'm not sure my staff thinks it's the greatest name, but I came up with it, and so that's what we have. But I mean, we do it every week. We have often it's our staff talking about one of the issues, but we also have a number of guests. We've had congressmen, senators, and what have you on it. It's in all the usual podcast places, or it's at our website, cis.org. I think it's pretty, it's 30 to 40 minutes. We don't overwhelm you. I try not to be too wonky, but if you want to know what's going on with immigration, I highly recommend it. And we don't sell mattresses or anything during the podcast. There's no ads. There's no nothing. So,
well, what did we miss that you would like to finish up with?
I don't know. You were talking about something, whether I got controversy on it. I think refugee resettlement maybe is something. I mean, it's a specific issue, but I wrote a piece arguing that refugee resettlement is immoral. It's morally wrong because it costs 12 times more to resettle a refugee than it does to take care of him back where he is. So what we're doing is, let's say there's 11 people floundering in the water. Instead of throwing each of them a life vest, which isn't great, but at least you won't drown, we send a yacht to pick one of them up and leave the rest of them there. There's no excuse for refugee resettlement. It's pure virtue signaling. And so if I wanted to provoke people, that's sort of what I try to lead with. Refugee resettlement, except in emergency cases, and there are some of those, but there's not very many, is morally wrong. And that really sort of gets the goat of a lot of the people.
And yet, when you explain it, it just seems apparent. It just seems like it's that this.
It sure is, but it's hard to get, like much of the immigration debate, it's hard to get people to the point of actually listening to what you're saying sometimes, because they're thinking about grandma from Minsk or something they saw on TV, his poor kid drowned or whatever, and that just stops. It's like a force field goes up and they don't hear anything else. So that's the challenge we've been always deal with in immigration.
Excellent. So is there another one?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, no. The only thing I would say is that for people who have a taste for snark and sarcasm, I'm on Twitter at Mark S. as in Stephen, Mark S. Krikorian. And
great.
It's
we
spelled
love
X,
snark and sarcasm.
Yeah, it's spelled X, but it's pronounced Twitter. So that's the way I pronounce it. So remember, Mark.
I'm going to steal that one. That one I'm going to steal.
Mark S. Krikorian. And a lot of it's on immigration, but I tweet on anything that pops into my head.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Wonderful.
Jennifer, do you have anything else?
I do not.
All right. Well, we'll have a little outro, and then if you'll hang out with us for just a minute.
Happy to do it.
Thank you, Mark.
This has been Reasonable Arguments News and Nonsense. There is so much BS on the mainstream media news, but you knew that. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. See you next time as husband and wife duo Jamie and Jennifer keep it real on Reasonable Arguments